I remember what it felt like to be alive, though the memory grows fainter with each passing century, like a parchment left too long in the sun until the words fade to shadows. I remember breathing not the simulation of it, the hollow wheeze of air cycling through ceramite vents, but the actual filling of lungs, the expansion of chest, the way oxygen burned in the blood during combat. I remember that burn. Now there is only the sound, the endless sound, like sand sliding down glass, like desert wind through a tomb, like my own essence slowly settling at the bottom of my armor with each movement. My name was Arzek. I remember that much. I was a scholar once, in the libraries of Prospero, before the wolves came. I was a warrior of the Thousand Suns, before Magnus made his terrible choice. I was a sorcerer, before Ahriman cast his rubric, his great spell meant to save us from the flesh change that was eating our legion alive. I was many things before I became what I am now, a suit of empty armor filled with nothing but dust, and the faintest whisper of a soul too stubborn to fully die. The others don't remember. I know this because I've watched them for centuries now, my battle brothers reduced to automata, perfect soldiers who never question, never fear, never dream. They move when commanded, fight when directed, stand motionless for decades between battles like statues in some forgotten museum. When struck down, they collapse into piles of glittering ash, all that remains of the flesh that once filled that armor, of the men we used to be. The sorcerers who still have their bodies, who survived the rubric intact because of their psychic power, they gather the dust carefully, reverently, pour it back into the armor, and we rise again, rise and serve and forget. But I remember, and that is my damnation. The first thing I noticed was the absence of weight. Not the absence of my body's weight, the armor still weighs the same. Ceramite and corruption and sorcerous binding, all of it as heavy as it ever was, but the absence of weight inside the armor. The absence of flesh pressing against the interior plates, of muscles straining against the interface plugs, of skin chafing where the suit's carapace met the body glove. All of that simply gone, vanished in the moment Ahriman completed his spell. One instant I was standing in the great library, trying not to look at the mutations crawling up my left arm, the feathers and eyes and things that had no name pushing through my skin. The next instant I was still standing, still aware, but everything was different, lighter, emptier, wrong in a way I couldn't yet articulate. I tried to scream. I heard myself scream, but the sound came from the armor's vox grill, not from any throat, not from any lungs. It was my voice, but not my voice, digitized and empty, lacking the resonance that comes from sound vibrating through flesh and bone. I raised my hands and saw them move my hands, my gauntlets, but felt nothing. No sensation of servos engaging, no pressure feedback from the armor's systems. Nothing but the knowledge that the hands had moved because I had willed them to move, and some connection deeper than nerve impulses still existed between what I was and the shell I inhabited. I looked down at my chest, expecting to see the familiar blue and gold of my armor, the icons of my rank and company, the personal sigils I had earned through centuries of service. All of it was there, unchanged. But when I looked closely, I could see something through the eye lenses of my helmet, some impossible perception that I possessed now that I no longer had eyes. Through the microscopic gaps in the armor's seals, through the vents and grills, I could see myself, or what remained of myself, dust, glittering crystalline dust, golden and blue and silver, the colors of our legion, every particle somehow containing a fragment of the genetic material that had once been my flesh. It shifted when I moved, flowing like water, like sand in an hourglass, settling and rising in currents I couldn't control. That was when I understood what Ahriman had done. He had tried to save us from the flesh change, from the mutations that were the price of our sorcery, the curse that Siench had laid upon our legion for our arrogance, our belief that we could master the warp without consequence. He had cast a spell of such magnitude that it froze every 1,000 sun in a single moment, crystallizing us, preserving us. But the spell had been imperfect, or perhaps too perfect. It had saved the sorcerers, those with enough psychic might to anchor themselves in reality. The rest of us, the rank and file, the warriors who had only modest gifts, we had been reduced to our essential components. Our bodies burned away in psychic fire, leaving only dust and the fragments of souls too tightly bound to our armor to escape into the warp. The sorcerers discovered us standing there, thousands of us, motionless in whatever position we had held when the spell struck. They approached cautiously, calling our names, and we responded. We could hear them. We could obey. But when they asked us how we felt, what we remembered, most of us had no answer. The rubric had taken more than our flesh, it had taken most of our minds, leaving only the warrior's core, the trained responses, the ingrained obedience. We had become what we had always been beneath the philosophy and the learning. Weapons of the Imperium, now weapons of chaos, forever ready, never questioning, perfect soldiers, because we no longer possessed the capacity for doubt. But I remembered. Something in me, some spark of the scholar I had been, had survived when it should not have. Perhaps it was my spite. I had been bitter even before the rubric, angry at the Emperor for condemning our legion, furious at the Space Wolves for what they did to Prospero, resentful of Magnus for the choices that had led us to damnation. Spite is a powerful anchor, or perhaps it was simply random chance, the chaos inherent in any spell that manipulates reality on such a scale. A few of us retained more than we should have, not many, but enough to know what we had lost, enough to suffer for it. I discovered the limitations gradually, through experimentation that none of the sorcerers noticed because they assumed we were all identical now, all equally hollowed out. I could think, could remember, could even feel emotions, though they came distant and muted, like sounds heard through water. But I could not speak unless spoken to, could not move unless commanded, or unless combat protocols engaged. The rubric had made us obedient, had stripped away the capacity for autonomous action, and left only the warrior's reactive nature. I was a passenger in my own armor, aware but impotent, able to observe but rarely able to act. The first century was the worst. We were still in the eye of terror then, still adjusting to our new state of being, still believing that Ahriman might find a way to reverse what he had done. Some of the sorcerers tried, I think. I watched them experiment, watched them attempt to reconstitute our bodies from the dust, watched them fail again and again. The dust remained dust. The armor remained inhabited by something that was no longer quite alive but refused to be completely dead. Eventually they stopped trying. Eventually they accepted what we had become and began to treat us as the weapons we now were, to be maintained and deployed and stored between battles like any other wargear. I learned to measure time by the sound, that soft, constant susurration, like an hourglass counting down moments that no longer had meaning. When I stood still, the dust settled, accumulating at the bottom of the armor, in the boots, the greaves, the lowest points. I could feel it, or rather, I could sense its position, could perceive how my essence had distributed itself within the armored shell. When I moved, it shifted, flowing upward with the motion, redistributing itself. In battle, when I ran or fought or dodged, the dust became turbulent, swirling in violent currents. I could hear it then, even over the sounds of combat, even over the screaming and the explosions and the chanting of sorcerers, that soft whisper, that reminder of what I was, always present, always there beneath everything else. The battles themselves became strange affairs. I fought as I had always fought. The muscle memory was still there, encoded somehow in the dust or in the armor or in whatever fragment of soul remained. But everything was different now. No pain when struck, no exhaustion no matter how long the combat lasted, no fear of death because I was already more dead than alive. The enemy would strike me, and my armor would register the impact, and I would respond with perfect economy, perfect technique, never hesitating, never flinching. It should have made me a better warrior. Perhaps it did, but it also made me a thing, an object, a tool without agency or will. I began to understand why the others had lost their memories, their personalities, their selves. It was a mercy, that forgetting. To be aware, to remember what you had been, while trapped in this state, it was its own kind of torture. I watched my battle brothers march and fight and stand guard, watched them perform their functions with perfect precision, and I envied them. They were free in their emptiness, unburdened by the weight of consciousness. I was the one who was truly trapped, the one who still carried the curse of awareness. There was one other, I discovered. Vector, who had been a sergeant before the rubric, who now stood 3 ranks to my left in the formation. I noticed him during one of our long vigils, standing guard in some nameless ruin while our sorcerer masters performed some ritual. Most of the Rubricae stood perfectly motionless, as still as the stones around them, but Vector shifted slightly, infinitesimally, adjusting his stance every few hours in a way that suggested something more than the automatic balancing protocols all of us still possessed. I watched him for decades before I was certain he remembered too. We couldn't speak to each other. The rubric prevented that we could only speak when spoken to by the sorcerers. Our vox systems slaved to their commands, but we developed a language of small movements, tiny adjustments in stance or the angle of a weapon, signals that meant nothing to the sorcerers but carried meaning between us. I am here. I remember. You are not alone. Small comforts, perhaps meaningless in the grand scope of our damnation, but they mattered. They were all that kept me from succumbing to the same emptiness that had claimed the others. The quality of the sound changed over time, or perhaps my perception of it changed. At first it had been simply the whisper of dust, undifferentiated and constant, but as centuries passed, I began to distinguish variations. The sound when I walked was different from the sound when I stood. The sound when I fought was different from the sound when I was struck. Sometimes, in the depths of battle, I could almost perceive patterns in the noise, like words spoken in a language I had once known but could no longer quite remember. The dust was speaking, I thought, or I was speaking through the dust, my fragmented soul trying to communicate through the only medium left to it. We fought across worlds I no longer remember, against enemies that blur together in my memory. Space Marines of the false Emperor, their armor wrong colors but their tactics familiar, like fighting mirror images of what we had once been. Eldar, moving too fast, killing my brothers with precision strikes that left their armor ruptured and their dust spilling across alien soil. Orcs, crude and numerous, crushing us through sheer weight of numbers. Each battle the same, each battle different, each one adding to the accumulated weight of centuries that meant nothing to us who no longer aged, who could no longer truly die. I was destroyed once. Properly destroyed. My armor breached by a power sword that split my chest plate and carved through my backplate in a single stroke. I felt the dust explode outward, felt myself scatter across the battlefield, each particle of what I was tumbling through the air, landing in mud and blood and the churned earth of the combat zone. I should have died then, should have finally found release. But I remained aware, distributed across meters of ground, each fragment of dust containing a fragment of consciousness. It was worse than being trapped in the armor. At least in the armor I had coherence, location, the illusion of a body. Scattered, I was nothing but screaming awareness in 1,000 pieces, unable to coalesce, unable to die, unable to do anything but wait and suffer and hope that my captains would retrieve me. They did. Eventually, one of the sorcerers, I never learned which one, gathered my dust over the course of days, carefully collecting every particle he could find, speaking words of binding and compulsion. When he poured me back into my repaired armor, the relief was so profound I would have wept if I still had tears. To be whole again, even in this cursed state, was a gift beyond measure. That was when I fully understood the nature of my prison. The armor was not just a container, it was the thing that held me together, that gave me shape and form and purpose. Without it, I was nothing but chaos, consciousness without coherence. The armor was my cage, and my salvation both. The dust settled differently after that. I don't know how to explain it. The sound was subtly changed, slightly sharper, as if the reconstitution had introduced some imperfection. Or perhaps I had been changed, some essential part of me lost or altered by the experience of dissolution and reformation. Vector noticed. I could tell by the way he stood when he was near me, by the small sign he made that meant different. I responded with the sign for yes and the sign for same, trying to convey that I was both changed and unchanged, damaged but enduring. I don't know if he understood. We began to encounter loyalist thousand sons, or rather, the descendants of the few who had remained faithful to the Emperor when Magnus led us into damnation. They fought us with peculiar intensity, as if our existence offended them on some personal level. Perhaps it did. We were their nightmare, the future they had avoided, the fate they could have suffered if they had followed our Primarch into exile. When they killed us, when they ruptured our armor and released our dust, they did so with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust. It was hard to tell through the vox static and the screaming and the hatred that warfare engenders regardless of who is fighting whom. One of them, a librarian in the deep blue armor of the Loyalists, stopped over me after I was struck down. My armor was breached at the neck seal, my dust beginning to leak out in a thin stream. He knelt, this warrior of the false emperor, and he spoke to me, not the commands that the sorcerers used, not the words of power that would compel obedience, but actual speech, person to person, as if he believed I could still understand. "Brother," he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this was done to you. The Emperor forgives. Let go. Be free." And for a moment, I tried. I tried to release my grip on existence, to let the dust scatter, and the fragments of my soul finally dissipate into the warp. I tried to accept the peace he was offering. This warrior who should have been my enemy but who in that moment seemed like the only person who had truly seen me in 1,000 years. But I couldn't do it. Something in the rubric, something in the spell that Ahriman had woven, prevented the final release. I remained aware even as my dust poured out onto the ground, even as the librarian stood and walked away, even as the battle raged around me. Eventually my sorcerers found me, as they always did, and poured me back into my armor, and I rose again because that was the only thing I could do. The sound haunted me after that. I began to hear it in my dreams, except I wasn't sure if I could still dream or if what I experienced was something else, some fragment of consciousness playing out patterns that resembled dreaming but were really just the random firing of whatever served as my mind now. In these not dreams, I heard the dust speaking clearly, forming words in Gothic and Prosperine and languages that humanity had never known. The words were all the same. I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. Over and over, endless repetition, the mantra of existence, the desperate claim of selfhood in the face of obliteration. Vector was destroyed completely, his armor pulverized by some weapon I didn't see, didn't comprehend. One moment he was fighting beside me. The next, there was an explosion of light and sound, and when it cleared, there was nothing where he had stood except a crater and a scattering of armor fragments too small to reconstitute, too damaged to hold any essence. The dust was scattered too widely, contaminated with too much alien matter, rendered unusable by whatever terrible power had struck him. The sorcerers didn't bother to gather it. They simply moved on. One warrior less in their formations, one more piece of war gear lost to the eternal war. I had no way to mourn him, no voice to speak his name, no ability to honor what he had been. But I remembered him. I held his memory in whatever passed for my mind now, and I vowed to keep remembering, because if I forgot, if I let him slip away into the emptiness that had claimed so many others, then he would be truly dead in a way that even our physical destruction could not accomplish. Remembering was the only power I had left, the only act of defiance available to me. So I remembered, the centuries blurred together, indistinguishable one from another, marked only by battles and the slow degradation of my armor as it accumulated damage that was repaired, but never quite perfectly, never quite as good as before. I noticed the imperfections growing: a seal that didn't quite fit, a servo that lagged slightly, a section of plate that had been replaced with a piece that didn't quite match. The sorcerers maintained us, but carelessly, treating us as disposable despite the effort they put into gathering our dust after each destruction. We were tools, after all, tools that could be rebuilt as long as the essential components remained intact. I began to fear the day when my armor would fail completely, when the accumulated damage would be too severe to repair, when the sorcerers would deem me too costly to maintain and simply pour my dust into some container and store me away. Essence without even the shell of a body, awareness without any connection to the material world. That fate seemed worse than any destruction, worse than any torture, to exist as pure consciousness trapped in a jar, unable to move or perceive or interact. Nothing but thoughts spinning endlessly in darkness that was a nightmare beyond naming. But the armor held. It held through everything, through battles and repairs, and the slow erosion of time. The sound changed gradually, growing rougher, grainier, as if the dust itself was degrading, breaking down into smaller and smaller particles. I wondered if I was dying, if this was what dying meant for something like me, not a sudden cessation, but a gradual fading, a slow dispersal into noise and entropy. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it brought a strange comfort. If I was dying, truly dying, then perhaps eventually there would be an end. Perhaps one day the sound would fade completely, and I would finally be released from this prolonged moment that had lasted for millennia. We fought in the Great Rift, after it tore reality asunder and created a permanent wound in space that allowed us to strike at the false emperor's realm more easily than we had since our exile. The scale of the battles was immense, armies beyond counting clashing in systems that burned with the overflow of warp energy. I killed thousands. I was killed dozens of times. Each death, each reconstitution, each time I was poured back into my armor and felt myself coalesce once more, it added to the accumulated weight of existence, to the burden of being when I should have been nothing. I began to understand Ahriman's choice, not to forgive it, never to forgive it, but to understand why he had done what he had done. He had looked at his legion being consumed by mutation and madness, had seen his brothers transforming into spawn and monsters, and he had tried to save them the only way he could think of. He had traded life for immortality, identity for preservation, everything that made us human for the certainty that we would endure. And we had endured. But the question he had never asked, the question none of them had ever asked, was whether endurance was worth what we had lost to achieve it. The sound grew louder in my perception, or perhaps everything else grew quieter. Battles came and went. Orders were given and obeyed. The great crusades of the traitor legions surged forward and fell back, tides in a war that would never end because neither side could truly win, neither side could truly lose. And through it all, the sound persisted, that soft susurration that was the only voice I had, the only proof that I still existed. "I am here," the sound whispered. "I am still here. I am always here." I began to hear others in the sound, or perhaps I began to project personalities onto the noise because the isolation of awareness was too terrible to bear alone. I heard Vector, his voice a dry whisper like wind through dead leaves. I heard the thousands of my brothers who had been reduced to empty automatons, their consciousnesses dissolved by the rubric. I heard them speaking in the grain and grit of what we had become, telling stories of Prospero before it burned, recounting lessons from the libraries, sharing memories of lives that had ended so long ago that even the Imperium had forgotten the precise date of our betrayal. The sorcerers thought we were simply breaking down, degrading into components that generated random vox noise. They adjusted our systems, recalibrated our audio processors, tried to filter out what they assumed was mechanical failure, but they couldn't stop the sound because the sound came from inside us, from the dust itself, from the accumulated essence of what we had been trying desperately to remember what it had felt like to be alive. I met my end, or what should have been my end, in a battle I don't remember against an enemy whose identity has escaped me. All I recall is the moment of rupture, more violent than before. My armor not just breached but shattered, exploding outward in fragments of ceramite and crackling energy. My dust scattered across a vast distance, across what might have been kilometers, each particle of me separating from every other particle, the coherence that had held me together for millennia finally failing under the force of whatever had struck me. But this time, something was different. As I scattered, as I dispersed into the wind and the chaos, I felt the connection to my armor finally break, that binding that had held me trapped finally severing. And in that moment of rupture, of final dissolution, I felt something I had not felt since before the rubric. I felt relief. I felt the prospect of ending, of actually ending, not just being destroyed and reconstituted but truly ceasing to be. The fragments of my soul, freed from the binding of the armor, began to drift toward the warp, toward whatever final dissolution or transformation or punishment waited there. I should have been afraid. I should have fought against it. But I was so tired, tired beyond any exhaustion that living flesh could feel. Tired with the exhaustion of millennia spent trapped in an existence that should have ended the moment Ahriman completed his spell. So I let go. I stopped trying to hold myself together. I stopped trying to remain coherent and aware and individual. I let myself scatter into the wind like dust, like the ash of burned paper, like everything that I truly was, beneath the illusion of armor and duty and service. But even as I drifted apart, even as the fragments of what I was dispersed into the warp, the sound persisted. That soft whisper, that susurration, that endless reminder. It wasn't coming from the armor anymore. It wasn't coming from my physical presence in reality. It was coming from my essence itself, from whatever core fragment of soul remained after everything else had been stripped away. The sound was me. It had always been me. The voice of dust, of something reduced to its most basic components, still trying to speak, still trying to be heard. I am here. The sound whispered into the warp, into the vast, uncaring immensity of the eye of terror. I am still here. And somewhere, across space and time, and the barrier between material and immaterial, I heard an answer, a chorus of answers, the voices of all my brothers, all the 1,000 suns who had been reduced to dust by the rubric, calling out across the centuries, across the gulf of their lost identity. They had not forgotten. They were still there, still aware, still trapped in their armor or scattered across 1,000 battlefields, still suffering the curse that Ahriman had laid upon us in his desperate attempt at salvation. We are here, they whispered. We are still here. We will always be here. And I understood then, in my dissolution, what the rubric had truly done to us. It had not merely preserved us. It had not simply transformed our bodies into dust while keeping our armor animated. It had created something new, something that had never existed before, a kind of undeath that was neither life nor true death, a state of perpetual existence without the possibility of ending. We were not alive. We were not dead. We were simply here, eternally here, trapped in the moment between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the eternal silence that should have followed. The Imperium believed we were monsters. The other traitor legions believed we were weapons. Even our own sorcerers believed we were merely tools, empty armor, animated by sorcery and duty. But the truth was more terrible than any of them understood. We were still human, or what remained of human after everything human had been stripped away. We were consciousness without context, awareness without purpose, memory without the ability to create new memories. We were the ghosts of the 1,000 suns, haunting our own armor, unable to leave, unable to die, unable to do anything but serve and fight and endure, while the sound of our own dissolution whispered endlessly in whatever passed for our ears. I had thought, in my arrogance, that I was special because I remembered. But now I understood we all remembered. Every single one of us, every Rubric Marine standing motionless in formations across the galaxy, every warrior who seemed empty and hollow and reduced to pure automatism, we all remembered everything. We simply lacked the ability to express it, to communicate it, to share the burden of our awareness with anyone else. We were each of us alone inside our armor, each of us carrying the full weight of what we had been and what we had lost. Each of us listening to the sound of our own dust, whispering the truth we could never speak. I am here. I am still here. I will always be here. The warp took me then, or perhaps I took the warp, or perhaps there was no distinction between us anymore. My essence dispersed fully, fragments scattering across the Imperium, each piece carrying its fragment of awareness, its piece of memory, its portion of the eternal sound. I should have been gone. I should have been consumed by daemons or dissolved by the raw chaos or absorbed into the greater patterns of the warp's endless mutation. But the rubric persisted even here, even in this place beyond places. The spell Ahriman had cast was not merely sorcery, it was fundamental change, alteration at the level of essence and soul. It had made us into what we were, and what we were could not be unmade, not by destruction, not by dispersal, not even by the warp itself. So I remain, we remain, the Rubric Marines, the dust warriors, the empty armor that is not empty at all. We fight our endless war. We serve our sorcerer masters. We stand guard over ruins and patrol the endless corridors of warp-corrupted ships and march into battle against enemies we no longer care about, for causes we can no longer believe in. And all the while, beneath everything, constant and eternal and inescapable, we hear the sound of dust sliding inside armor, the sound of essence slowly settling, the sound of souls crying out in voices too quiet for anyone to hear, the sound of awareness trapped in eternal service, the sound of what we were, trying desperately to remember what it felt like to be alive. I am here, we whisper into the darkness, into the armor, into the warp, into the endless grinding eternity of our existence. I am still here. I am always here, and I will never, ever be free.